Right, so let's go live. Um, Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Anthony Teasdale from the European Parliamentary Research Service, and we're delighted to welcome Bob Zoellick as our guest speaker this afternoon to discuss a book which he published recently. This book, America in the World, A History of US Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, and it's attracted a great deal of interest, both because of its depth and its scale and its sweep, which really takes in the whole of US political history and the projection of the United States as a force in the world throughout that period, and also perhaps because of its timing, coming at the end, in the event, of one of the most turbulent and difficult periods of America's relations with its allies, and indeed not so allies around the world. Now, Bob Zoellick is perhaps best known in his capacity as having been for many years president of the World Bank. But before that, he had a very distinguished career in American public service. He was counselor to both a Secretary of State in the State Department and also a US Treasury Secretary. He was Undersecretary and Deputy Secretary at the State Department. He was Deputy Chief of Staff at the White House, and he was US Trade Representative as well. So nobody really knows the executive branch in the United States as well, particularly the outward-facing dimensions of that, and then went on to become, of course, President of the World Bank. So with that combination of domestic and global experience, he, of course, is very well placed to have written this classic history, I would describe it. It's very much a book in the old school, and I think a very enjoyable book to read as a result of that. It's not jargon-laden. It doesn't assume a huge prior understanding of any subject. It seeks for anybody who's politically alert to provide a very interesting history and roadmap, really, of US foreign policy and diplomacy. And it has two sort of approaches. On the one hand, historical, by taking figures from Alexander Hamilton onwards. And I think it's very interesting. He starts with Alexander Hamilton. Not only is that a very contemporary figure in a way to start with, but also because it deals with the origins of power. And I want to just quote very briefly from what he says about Hamilton. He says, the foundation of Hamilton's system was economic and political strength. He said, Hamilton's system also included the federal constitution, an effective national government, and a standing navy and army. He apprehended how the interconnections of economic capacities, finance, military power, and political institutions created national security and international influence. He even recognized how technology and innovation contributed to economic and military power. And I think there are some interesting questions posed, if you like, by the Hamilton vision for the European Union today and what it takes to be a powerful player in the world. He then takes us through 200 and more years of American political history, focusing, of course, on its external policies, both political and economic. And then he tries to analyze, if you like, recurrent themes, 5 traditions, as he describes them, in American diplomacy. The North American base, which is very interesting, I think, particularly from a non-American perspective, to realize how grounded it was in the continent. The role of trade and technology, the search for alliances and the construction of alliances, the need for public and congressional support, and also the desire to have a kind of higher purpose to justify America's policies in the world. So that really is what this book's about. It's a sensational read. I must say I found it one of the most enjoyable books I've read about American history ever. And that's why I thought it would be great if Bob could join us today to tell us a little bit more about the book than I've just summarized it. And perhaps I could start by asking you a question, which is, why did you decide to write it and how did you write it?
Well, Anthony, first, let me thank you very much for that glowing introduction. And it's a real privilege here to be back with the European Parliament sort of research service. So the reason I wrote the book is that when I was in government, I drew upon history in thinking through problems. And I wanted to encourage others to do so as well, especially the next generation. Many foreign policy courses in the US, and I suspect Europe today, focus on international relations theory. And while they're intellectually fun to work around and to master, my experience was that they were of limited use when I dealt with issues like as diverse as German unification or trade strategy or genocide in Darfur or World Bank and development issues. And so what I wanted to focus on in this book was practical problem solving. in the 90s titled Diplomacy, where he focused on history to explain foreign policy. He wrote it from what we'd call the European realpolitik perspective. And so in this book, I wanted to include that experience, but also broaden it to talk more about aspects of the American pluralistic experience and ideas in foreign policy. And I suppose in my various government posts, I often had younger assistants, and because I have an interest in history, I probably used to torture them by asking history questions because I didn't know how much they knew. And I discovered insofar as they had known history, it tended to be from World War II on. And the first 150 years are full of some quite fascinating figures and incidents that I wanted to recall from the mists of time. And I suppose one other idea in the back of my mind, Anthony, was that, these are trying times. And sometimes if you read the daily news, people have a sense of frustration. And I wanted to suggest that even imperfect results in a far from perfect world can meet a standard. So in some ways, there's a certain history or optimism to this, where I'm trying to suggest history can offer insights on how to do better as opposed to recollection of timeless obstacles. Can I talk a little bit more, Anthony, or did you want to follow up with questions?
How did you actually go about it? Because I think this is the first time you've written a really substantial piece of work like this, and all authors usually find the first major book they write a really serious challenge. So did it take a very long time to write? Did you set aside time completely exclusively for this purpose? How far did you depend upon your own personal library, or do you research in libraries? What was the process by which you wrote it?
Well, in some ways, it draws on a life work. I had studied diplomatic history in college. I obviously worked with it over the course of 30 or 40 years. The idea for the book really did start to germinate when I read Kissinger's Diplomacy in the 90s, and I thought about trying to take a similar approach, but focusing on the notion of stories. So as you suggested, I thought that to appeal to a wider audience, I'd use the multiple biographical methods. So I focus on people, and I focus on particular episodes. The introduction actually begins before Hamilton. It begins with Benjamin Franklin in Paris, and actually even in London before that, during our revolution. And this is a way that I could try to focus on practical problem solving, but also try to work in some of my experience and insights on the conduct of diplomacy. In terms of the focus for this audience, so understand that after the elections in 2016, I thought maybe I rather than deal with the day-to-day, I'd sort of go back to the past. In some ways, it was easier to work with dead people than alive ones. And so I focused the past 3 or 4 years on this. But a lot of the thinking and work, the outline, was kind of pre-existing. But I had a seminar up at Harvard with professors and some graduate students. I had the help of Daniel Chardell, who's a PhD student at Harvard, to do some of the research. You'll see I'm very obviously relying on a lot of secondary sources that people have worked over time, but I did dig into some of the primary materials, which often offer sort of additional insights along the way. Interestingly, the seminar at Harvard kept encouraging me to also work in my own assessments. And so I think, as you suggested, Anthony, one thing that differentiates this book is while I'm trying to tell the stories in a way that has a color and gives a sense of the problem solving, I do try to work in some more of the particular insights, including into the conduct of diplomacy. So I was pleased that Canadians and Australians have both told me that they want to use this book for their diplomatic sort of education courses. And also, you'll see that it varies a little bit in chapters. So for example, I have a chapter on Vietnam and LBJ Lyndon Johnson's decision to really Americanize the war on the ground in late 64, early 65. That's been very well researched ground, including by Fred Logoval at Harvard. But so what I really added to that was my assessment of a policymaker of what went wrong. And I sort of identify 6 factors that I think led them to a tragedy. And if you reflect on those 6 factors, they're not a bad set to look at for other interventions, either in other times of history or going forward.
Thank you. And yes, please do tell us a little bit about what central conclusions you drew from the book in terms about what makes American foreign policy more or less successful over time.
Well, again, just to give from a European perspective, let me just touch on a few of the stories, because the stories kind of are the heart of the book. So as I mentioned, part of the reason I started with Ben Franklin was that he had a very weak hand to play. And former Secretary of Defense Mattis said a few years ago that he was having to deal with the fact that the United States didn't have total domain dominance. And I was reflecting, well, in history, there's much of the time you didn't have total domain dominance. So, how did you conduct your diplomacy? And as a diplomat, I was also pointing out that, of course, Franklin had to negotiate with his own delegation. He had to negotiate with Congress. He had to negotiate with his French ally. And then finally, of course, he had to negotiate with Great Britain. He also starts with a new type of public diplomacy. Remember, Franklin was famous, but nobody knew the United States. And he represented himself in a way that kind of caught French society in its sense of style. Ultimately, he and the US delegation ignored the instructions from the Congress, which were to stay aligned with the French. Not surprisingly, those had been accomplished through the French delegation in the United States. They negotiate these excellent terms with Great Britain, and France is on the sidelines. Then he has to renegotiate a loan or get another loan from France. And I love there's a response from the French secretary to the legation when asked if he wanted to file a protest. He said, "Great powers never complained, but they felt and remembered," which is a wonderful line. As you then said, the reason I focused on Hamilton early in the first chapter was he's Secretary of the Treasury. He's not Secretary of State. And this is, you're exactly right. I wanted to draw this out for statecraft for the European Union. Also, Hamilton suggests a very striking idea. He was, of course, an officer on Washington's staff in the Revolution. He's part of the Battle of Yorktown. But he turns to his recent foe, Britain, and offers what today we would call sort of a strategic partnership for the United States to fit within Britain's trading system. Interestingly, they then called it First Minister, today we'd call it Prime Minister, Lord Shelburne, who had signed the peace treaty, had a very similar idea. But here's another takeaway: the politics in both countries basically preclude this for over a century. As I've mentioned to some of my French friends, of course, there's so much going on during the French Revolution and Napoleonic period that the sale of Louisiana would be a footnote in French history. But it's an interesting little moment where Napoleon, between 1801 and 1803, with the brief peace, starts to think about a new world empire where he'd have the rich Caribbean islands, New Orleans, and Louisiana as a vast territory. There's also a little piece of Spanish history here for your broader European context. And so I explore the question, was Jefferson lucky or was he good in terms of how he accomplished this negotiation? Another one that probably doesn't reach much into the European mindset was during our Civil War of 1861 to 1865, Europe, particularly Britain and France, almost intervened. You find many books in the US on battles and strategies and social effects, but very few on the foreign policy. But it was absolutely critical to avoid the intervention. France, as some may recall, actually put a Habsburg on the Mexican throne during this period, so you had a broader intervention. And so in this case, you have a very interesting example of how Lincoln and Seward have to combine threat with compromise. They're playing brinksmanship to try to ward off the European intervention. Then at the turn of the 20th century, with John Hay and Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, you have the United States sort of rising to world power. And Roosevelt, who we often, associate more with the Great White Fleet and sort of military power, actually wins the Nobel Peace Prize for a very masterful mediation of the Russo-Japanese War and perhaps a somewhat forgotten event, the first Moroccan crisis in 1905-06. And Roosevelt saw this exactly in the European politics of the time. He was worried these would lead to a global conflagration among the great powers, which of course, another event on the frontiers of Europe and the Balkans within 10 years does exactly that. And so his aim is to try to reestablish an equilibrium of a balance of power. And so there's a fascinating story here about diplomatic mediation. Wilson, from the American point of view, is trying to preserve neutrality from 1914 to 17. So the rest of Europe and much of the world's at war. But the new U-boat threat basically challenges the notion of freedom of seas and neutrality. And Woodrow Wilson, who, recall, was a political science professor, can't just come to a decision. He has to come with a theory to this. So he basically comes up with the idea that neutrality can be redefined in a new era as collective security. And the whole collective security concept that we've sort of dealt with for over a century sort of comes from his early thinking. I also touch on a point some Europeans might find interesting. My friend Phil Zoellick is going to have a book on this coming out quite soon, which was there a chance to mediate World War I at the end of 1916? And I think the elements are there that at least that was a real possibility. But I draw out that while Wilson had visions and he wasn't bad on tactics, he was very weak on what I call the operational art, putting those together, which, by the way, is a big challenge of diplomacy. In the interwar years of 20s and 30s, I wanted to draw out some very important ideas. This is the international law tradition, which is very important. The U.S. made a lot of contributions. And that tradition, even with all its uncertainties, is really at the heart of the European Union legal order. I mean, and today, when I often talk with Americans or even friends in the UK, to understand the EU, one has to understand it as kind of a legal order arrangement. There was also a very interesting effort with arms control, but what I draw out, it wasn't just arms control, it was linked to sort of regional security issues. This was in the case of the Pacific and naval arms control. But there's some echoes of this if you think about dealing with North Korea in Northeast Asia today, or Iran in the wider Middle East. And of course, also of great interest to Europeans, this was the great era of trade protectionism of the US, the Smoot-Hawley Bill. This leads in 1934 to kind of a little recognized act, the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, only 3 pages long, that actually starts to shift power over trade from the Congress to the executive branch. And that has persisted today when you discuss trade promotion authority or fast track. Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, who did the trade negotiations at that time, negotiates some 31 agreements with 28 countries. And critically, those principles become the basis of the GATT. So this chapter can help readers understand the legal, the constitutional, the political, the economic basis of US trade policy for today. Of course, especially important from the European vantage point, I focus on the period of 1947-49 that is the basis of the American alliance system that we've been living with now for 70 years. And what I try to emphasize is that scholars sometimes like to write about grand strategies and plans. This was not planned. It was a series of responses. The Marshall Plan is designed to offer an economic framework for European recovery, and I might add integration, to avoid a military commitment. The United States didn't want to keep a large number of forces in Europe. The troops wanted to come home. But very quickly, people recognized the Marshall Plan wouldn't work unless you had Germany as part of it. So this leads to the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany. That, of course, leads to the Berlin crisis and the security threat. And also France and others said, well, if we're going to allow Germany to come back on the political stage, we need to have some reassurance. So that leads to the third component, the creation of the North Atlantic Alliance. And these events are also important as people think about alliances because particularly with Berlin, it adds this critical question of when you offer alliance security, particularly in a nuclear age, how far are you going? And this was issues of John F. Kennedy and crisis management, comes back in another way, sort of in Vietnam. I have a chapter on a man named Vannevar Bush, who you wouldn't find in most foreign policy books. But he's the godfather of science and technology policy in the United States, both during World War II and afterwards. And I wanted to include him because not only do I think this was very important in the ultimate success of the United States and the West with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, but obviously issues of science and technology policy loom rather large as we think about China today. And one other dimension, which is I was trying to introduce the notion of the challenge of combining science policy and diplomacy, which obviously relates to climate change issues, biological security issues, and cyber topics. I have a chapter on Ronald Reagan, and my sense is that he's still a hard figure for Europeans, maybe many Americans, to fully sort of grasp. And a friend of mine who's writing a biography of him said he thought it was the best one chapter discussion of Reagan's foreign policy. Reagan was an autodidact. He was self-taught, and he used his writing actually all his life for radio scripts and others to kind of shape his ideas. And so more than any other modern president, he used his speeches to think through positions. And he frames what in effect is the battle of ideas of the Cold War. But critically to understanding the success was how he combined that with the help of key people. So this week, George Shultz has passed away. George Shultz played a key role in picking up Reagan's interest in being a negotiator, because he had been a union negotiator, and combining the ideas with negotiations. And my former boss, James Baker, did something similar on the domestic and international economic side. And then the last formal chapter is the George Herbert Walker Bush with the Alliance leadership. And as Christina Spohr talked about in her recent book talk that we had on Post-Wall, Post-Square, it's also important to understand how Bush was not only sort of the leader in terms of the end of the Cold War in Europe and the Gulf War, but putting the foundations for a lot of sort of future post sort of war policies. And then as you talk about, I take 5 traditions, I summarize them, but then I also try to apply them to sort of the more modern presidencies. But I'll close with the 5 traditions. First, as you said, is the importance of North America. Obviously, this is the key in 19th century history. I argue there's a good argument for it in 20th century history too. I came across Ronald Reagan's speech when he launched his presidential campaign in 1979. Had an idea that you wouldn't find today, which was, he said, you know, it's time that we stop thinking about our nearest neighbors, Canada and Mexico, as foreigners. And of course, the better off they are, the better off we'll be. Now, this is an interesting idea because from a European context, this led to the notion of shared sovereignty. But given the history of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, all 3 had a very strong sense of independence and sovereignty. So our integration model couldn't be based on shared sovereignty. It had to take a different approach. But it's also relevant today in that if you think about what subjects the American public is interested in international affairs, immigration, narcotics, crime, sort of environment, economics, those are North American topics. And I try to make the point that it's not only a question of hemispheric or sort of cooperation, but North Americans should see this as a continental base for their operations abroad. And the stronger you are with 500 million people, 3 democracies, energy self-sufficiency, better demographics, the more effective U.S. will be globally. And this is a point that it's interesting. If you check the websites of most foreign policy institutes in the United States, you'll see European policy, Asia policy, Mideast, some Latin, very rarely North American policy. The second, as you mentioned, is trade, transnationalism, and technology. And here, what I was stressing, going back to the Model Treaty of 1776 that John Adams was involved with, Americans looked upon trade from the start as more than a matter of economic efficiency. This was the primary interconnection with the world. And recall, at that time, you're in a world of mercantilism and empires. So their concept was using governments to pry open room for private sector actors. And of course, that's really the lead to the whole world of transnational relations, which has been critical in European thinking and development. And obviously it's important in terms of the influence of societies way beyond the formal part of governments. Third is the point on alliances. And here, in some ways, you can look upon the American hostility to alliances as a sort of a separation from what they perceived as the European order of the 18th century, and to agree, early 19th century. And so much of American foreign policy is an effort to develop alternatives to the notion of alliances. So there's international law, there's economic arrangements, there's various types of arms control ideas. There's the experience of the Union as kind of a form of cooperation among different parties. But then you have this amazing shift in 47, 49, where you develop a new type of alliance structure. It's what structures much of the international system for 70 years. And then the interesting question is, where will it go today? The subject, I'm sure, is a topic for the European Parliament. Fourth, I talk about the importance of Congress and public support. And I'm sure this is true in Europe as well. Many foreign policy experts often kind of ignore this. They put this in the domestic political camp. George Kennan, a great thinker, had no ability with Congress. But if you think, particularly from the perspective of the European Parliament, public attitudes are absolutely fundamental to your relations with whether Russia or China or others. I try to draw this out with a man named Senator Vandenberg, who was a Republican, very important in this 47, 49 period with Truman. But if you think about it today, it's a question, will the Biden administration get support from the Congress? What leading role will they play? And then, as you mentioned, I close with this notion of America's purpose. And here, I'm not trying to hit the drum of American exceptionalism, because there's many cases of exceptionalism around the world. But I use an anecdote to draw it home, which is, for those of you that still carry wallets and have a dollar bill someday, go look at the back of the dollar bill, and you'll see what is called the Great Seal of the United States. You probably never gave it much thought, but you see this unfinished pyramid. Notice it's unfinished. The Eye of Providence above it, and below it, Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So from the very start, these people were thinking in rather big terms. And my point is, the notion of the purpose evolves over time. At first, it's simply to preserve a republic in a world of empires. And it's the preservation of the Union. And it over time, I think there are three factors. One is, of course, the international context. Second, what's the public support? And third, a notion of aspiration for freedom and liberty. But, is, as Wilson said, is it to make the world safer democracies, or is it to make the world into democracies? The four freedoms of Franklin Roosevelt, the leader of the free world. And then, of course, this is a debate you hear echoed through Washington and the Biden administration today. So maybe that's a good place to stop.
Thank you very much indeed, Bob. Now, I'd like to invite the 95 people who are currently online to pose questions to Bob Zoellick. And whilst you're doing so, I'd like to ask you a specific follow-up question, which I think is something which here in Europe people don't think about very much, namely the failure of the United States to ratify the Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations. I mean, that seems to me, in retrospect, to be a seminal moment in American history. Of course, it's washed away by bigger events later. But do you think that if the United States, in fact, if President Wilson or his successors had been able to master the public opinion and congressional dimension more directly, that the history of the world post the First World War would have been any different?
Well, it's the might have beens of history, but this is where you need to draw it back to foreign and domestic policy. In sort of American folklore, after World War II and the failure of the 30s in particular, but also to a degree of the 20s, there was a view that not joining the League of Nations was the fundamental mistake that sort of led to the Second World War. When you dig into the story, what you see is that first, Wilson, and this was sort of part of his political weakness, is very poor at bringing along his political system. He doesn't have any other senators. He doesn't have any Republicans. Regularly doesn't consult much with anybody in the Congress. I draw quite a contrast to this actually in a negotiation in 1921-22 with the naval treaties, where you have Republicans and Democrats being part of the key negotiating role and helps get all the treaties through. But in addition, there were questions legitimately being raised about the constitutional authority. What were you committing to with the League of Nations? Was it a legal commitment? Was it a political commitment? Did this commit the United States to go to war? In a chapter I have on a man named Elihu Root, who was kind of one of the drivers of American international law, there were two things. One is he was saying, look, if we're going to be serious about a security commitment, let's for example, if France needs a treaty alliance of security, let's give that to France, but let's not then be straight with the American public what it's about. Okay, but this notion of loose collective security, he was worried could be the worst of all worlds. You kind of have this idea that people are going to sort of deal with threats, but are they really committed to do so? And then there's the practical step where Root, who had actually been a Secretary of War, Secretary of State, US Senator, comes up with a series of reservations. These aren't actually amendments, but he comes up with reservations. And there's a pretty good case that I think the treaty could have passed with the reservations that would have tried to accommodate it to the Constitution. But Wilson basically rejects any of the reservations. And this is in the final vote, some Democrats, which was his party, it would have supported the reservations, don't, because they don't want to be crossing Wilson. So Wilson sort of plays for all or nothing. And you have to recall that Wilson's political strategy, which he had done a number of times in his life, was to go out to the public, kind of get the public support. And for people that know American history, he tries to do this in 1919, and of course has a fatal stroke, which certainly inhibited his ability probably to sort of think through political strategies. So it might have been is that if the United States had offered a more serious security commitment, if we'd been a sort of a more active part, whether one could have precluded some of the events, perhaps these are, but one of the other points from a historiography point of view, there's a tendency, including in the Europeans who study America, to look at all this period as sort of isolationist. It's really not. In the 1920s, you have the economic efforts in terms of German reparations, the Dawes Plan, and another plan, the Young Plan. But as I draw attention to the Washington Naval Conference and the regional East Asia security structure is a quite active involvement in terms of future security arrangements. The system really comes apart with the Great Depression. And that's where you have the breakdown of the economic order and the security dimensions of that, including in terms of Japanese politics, which I suppose is another cautionary note about the dangers of economic breakdown globally.
Excellent, thank you very much for that. And questions are now coming in. My last personal question is to ask you the following. You say my previous question was, it might have been. Let's talk about something that very much was, and which you yourself were personally centrally involved in, namely the process of German reunification. Between the relationship between Thatcher and Reagan and the relationship between George Bush Sr. and Helmut Kohl, there was a very significant shift, it seems to me, in terms of American priorities and America's perception of the future of Europe. You were a central part of that. I mean, not only as an advisor, but you actually, I think, helped shape that evolving policy. Can you tell us a little bit about the transition, if you like, between Reagan and Bush Sr.?
Well, this, as in the book, it's a story of both people and ideas and different viewpoints. The Reagan, I have great respect for Margaret Thatcher and what she accomplished. She obviously could be a very driving personality. She had a special relationship with Reagan. And while Bush respected her, he kind of felt she was a little lecturing or hectoring. He didn't quite connect with her in his own sort of personal way. Interestingly, he of course developed quite a good relationship with Mitterrand and with Kohl and others. But with Thatcher, it was always a little difficult, although he respected her. But the key difference really came down to a policy view. So, it's pretty clear that the moment of German unification, the prospect was there, that Thatcher was very, very reluctant, felt that would destabilize Europe. She was also concerned about its effect on Gorbachev. The U.S. view was that the events on the ground, first off, we did have a view that, we'd been committed to Germany and the democratic Germany being unified for 40 years, and we needed to sort of keep faith with that promise to the German people. Second, events on the ground would clearly gaining their own momentum. People from particularly East Germany moving to West Germany. And as a diplomat, you had to figure out, if the United States and others sought to block that, could you have a different sort of crisis on the ground? Would people perhaps go after Soviet troops or, the Stasi, And so the next part was to figure out how you could take that momentum on the ground and connect it to your policy. And so in a sense, our strategy was to get ahead of the caravan here and steer it in a certain direction, and thereby use the momentum to actually push those that were reluctant for a while, France, Britain, certainly the Soviet Union, to accept German unification on terms, and this was quite important from a European perspective, that also learned some lessons from history about how Germany needed to be integrated in Europe. So today, many people, historians, kind of look at this related simply to what we'll call the Russia question. We were focused on the German question. So since 1871, the German question was, how do you deal with a major power in the heart of Europe without natural borders that could dominate its neighbors? And we'd had 2 world wars and the Franco-Prussian War as sort of test cases. So our logic was we wanted to embed a democratic Germany, not only within NATO, but also within European structures. And this led to another little difference that you're alluding to, is that, and I did have a role in this at the time, which is that you could see that the European integration process was proceeding. You had the EC 92 effort. President Bush was somewhat worried that it would become a protectionist fortress Europe. We had discussions actually with Delors about making sure you had the Uruguay round, which eventually led to the WTO, combined with European integration. I was frankly helped because I developed a friendship with Pascal Lamy, who at that time was the chef de cabinet for Delors, and we got along sort of very well, helped me understand the momentum. But again, from a U.S. interest point of view, our logic was, let's connect with these new European structures while also maintaining ties with the member states. So sometimes there's a simplistic view of, well, do you deal with Brussels or do you deal with the capitals? Well, you deal with both. And from the US point of view, as you develop a European Central Bank, European Parliament, others, you need to sort of expand the nature of your ties. So the amazing thing about this is, it all occurs within really 10 months. So it's very fast paced. And of course, this has the might have beens too, because by December of 1990, Shevardnadze resigns, you have a coup in the Soviet Union. So the notion was always on the back of our mind that this could come apart rather quickly. And so we needed to use that momentum to channel it within arrangements, legal arrangements. But as part of that, we wanted to reshape the transatlantic relations, European integration, and we hoped US relations with Europe. Now, over the past decades, some of that has not turned out exactly as one want, but I still think the strategy was a sound one.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to now take the first question that's come in, which is from Bruno Diaz Pinero, and he says the following. Towards the end of the book, Bob refers to historians who may eventually view Obama's diplomatic reticence as a precursor to Donald Trump's blunt reversal. Could you please elaborate further on how you now see the Obama legacy?
Yeah, first off, the reason I stopped the formal chapters with Bush 41 was because anytime you write about recent periods, you run the risk of it falling into a partisan debate, and particularly if you're a participant, as I was. But my seminar said, look, you can't just end with 92. There's a lot that happened. So that's where I came up with this notion of the afterword to try to apply the next 4 presidencies within the framework of the 5 traditions. And I had another shrewd idea here, which is, for those of you that have studied government, there's a famous book in the United States called Presidential Power by Richard Neustadt. And it had multiple editions, and each time he added a different afterword. So, so, so that was, perhaps I get subsequent editions. But as for Obama, I always connected quite well with him personally. I worked with him when I was at the World Bank. A lot of respect for him. But he comes in at a time of economic crisis. The United States has 2 long wars. He often saw himself actually as respecting President Bush 41's foreign policy. But since I was part of that, but also kind of knew the Obama, I realized he didn't really have the sense of kind of how the United States could lead, but without being quite so sort of blunt or arrogant about it, and could kind of maneuver the parties. And so he had a bit of an approach that was kind of reserve and distance. And I saw this actually in his reactions with foreign leaders. It's who he is as a person. He's not, sort of the warm. This is not Joe Biden's sort of warm and sort of fuzzy relationship. And then if you combine it with various policies, the red line in Syria that no longer became the red line. In Asia, there was a concern about, whether he would really stand up for kind of the U.S. security set of requirements. I don't personally think all this was justified, but part of foreign policy is the appearance. You remember, he often liked to refer to the arc of history. So another problem was a little hard. Well, it'll be solved by the arc of history. And, I kind of, as a practitioner, I say, sometimes you actually have to lean into that arc. You have to push it in one way or another. So what I was trying to suggest there is that it actually built off the fact that it's a point that Christina touches on in her book. If you look at where Bush 41 ends the policy, in the Gulf, NAFTA, Uruguay round, APEC, some of his work with the UN as part of the coalition, in the Mideast peace process, it sets the foundations actually for much of the Clinton and the George W. Bush presidency, recognizing they're very different people, including on trade policy, which obviously I care about. And yet you could start to see in Obama, it starts to turn on these issues. And let me give you one other example from trade policy that's applicable to today. So because of the domestic politics, in President Obama's first term in trade, he does nothing. I mean, his trade minister basically said, oh, we don't want to be deal crazy, too many free trade agreements, so on and so forth. He recognizes by the start of his second term that this is a mistake. And I know this from conversation with Tom Donilon as National Security Advisor. So he embraces the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which he didn't do at all in his first term. And Michael Froman, the USTR, comes over from the White House to take this over. I urged Mike to take the job so he could have his sort of leadership role. And they're 1 year too late. So in 2015, Paul Ryan, then the Republican Speaker of the House, passes this Trade Promotion Authority, gets Republican votes. If they'd done TPP by 2015, it would have been passed by the Congress. Instead, they do it in 2016. It's a little bit late. They've got some leftover issues. So that's an example of, in a sense, even if you want to have a restrained sense of power, you need to combine it with a sense of activism, schedule, timing, how you're going to pull these pieces together. And that's where I think historians will find that Obama was a little bit pulled back. And then, of course, Trump is a very sharp reversal.
Thank you. But of course, the problem wasn't just with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it was also with TTIP. And do you think there's a more fundamental problem about the way the US approaches its international economic relations, which is that it tends to be extremely aggressive in its approach to trade negotiations? I mean, one former senior Obama administration person said in a conversation I was a party to we over-negotiated TTIP, and of course the opportunity was lost, in effect, to establish a kind of Western global international economic order in a way through that. Now, you served as USTR, you must have seen this close up. Did you feel that your people were sometimes being were over-negotiating in terms of getting what, on one calculus, was clearly a defense of US interest, but on another might not serve the broader geopolitical interests of the United States?
It's a very interesting question, Anthony. I'd frame it a little differently. First off, and this is where the chapter on Cordell Hull and U.S. trade policy will help people understand it. And it's a little different than in the European Commission structure, where you've got the competence of the European Commission Although, as you start to expand to investment and other accords, you're finding, working with the member states is not quite so easy as you saw with the Canadian agreement. And in the case of the United States, you have to deal with the constituencies that are reflected in the Congress. So that's part of your trade politics. So as I've explained to many European friends, agriculture may be small as a percentage of the US economy, but it looms large in trade politics because with our Senate, 2 senators from each state, a lot of farm states, you got a lot of farm senators, even though it's a smaller part of the economy. And also in our system like yours, since the 30s, they've been getting subsidies of various forms. And so they're very well organized in terms of that. And you just have to understand that, whether the sort of is as part of your trade politics. But I think the bigger issue is whether it's climate or trade, you have to have a command of the details. You have to have a command of the politics, but you have to also have a sense of strategy of kind of what you're sort of trying to achieve. And there's always a risk in any negotiation, but particularly in trade side, that people will get all caught up in the frictions of an issue that if they pull back is kind of secondary. Now, it's easy sometimes to say that from the outside because it may not be secondary to the politics and how you sort of pull together the coalition. But so, to take TTIP without getting into all the details of it, the heart of what would make TTIP different was trying to get some mutual recognition of standards or convergence of standards. This is very difficult. Lemmy and I had a story about how we tried to do this with maritime safety equipment, and it took 10 years. And at the end, they were debating. They had red warning lights, but what range of red would be qualified? So this is when you bring in regulatory agencies, it becomes it's somewhat of a nightmare. My own view was bringing this back to diplomacy. It was probably best to start with removing as many of the traditional barriers as you can, but then start with various sectors, and where those sectors already had sort of transatlantic cooperation. There was some in pharmaceuticals, there was some in autos, and that they could agree on reducing costs. And at the time, I could identify 5 or 6 sectors that you could probably make some headway on that. And then you create processes for others going forward. So that's a diplomatic negotiating strategy that is also related to the economic reality of what you can accomplish, recognizing regulatory agencies take a different view of this than traditional trade policy. I'll apply this to climate change because I was actually in charge of the one U.S. climate change negotiation that the Senate ratified, the 92 Framework Agreement, which is the heart of all these COPs that have gone on beforehand. And I was quite involved with it when I was at the World Bank. I've listened to some of the senior U.S. officials talk about climate change, which they're clearly committed to. And there's a sense of moral purpose, there's a sense of significance. When I try to listen for the diplomatic strategy, it's a little vague to me. and this is important if you're going to figure out how you're going to bring in developing countries, sort of the financial aspects of this. So I think the bigger point, Anthony, is I'd say the tough negotiations, which, if you think the U.S. is tough, spend some time with the Indians. And by the way, Europeans are no slouches at holding their lines on issues, as Britain has discovered. So it's more that can the people who get into the details, will somebody be supervising them and sort of keeping a look at the whole? And by the way, this is going to be quite important for Europe going forward because, the Biden administration clearly is talking about multilateralism. They want to reach out to Europe. There's alliance politics. I think all that's well intentioned from the foreign policy people. We'll have to see. The trade appointees may reflect some constituencies you had to deal with under Lighthizer with the Congress. And if that's the case, I don't know the newest trade nominee, Catherine Tai, other than by reputation. She's a reputation, very good trade lawyer, very knowledgeable about trade. My question will be, can she move above being a trade lawyer? Can she also connect this with a larger strategy? And time will tell.
Thank you for that. I'm going to take another question now. Elena Lazarou, and it actually segues quite neatly from your remarks concerning climate change. She says, Henry Kissinger always argued that in the end it is the state that conducts diplomacy, but there is an argument that the actors and players now in foreign policy and diplomacy include more than just states. Could you comment on this new multi-actor paradigm in diplomacy, and how might it change some of the lessons from the past that you present in your book?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and that's kind of why in this early point of my traditions, I try to draw out transnational actors. And it's, while I have great respect for Dr. Kissinger, it's where I have some differences in understanding the American experience. You can't understand the American attitude towards China without understanding the missionary movement, which, by the way, still has attitudes. We're still trying to convert the Chinese in various ways, whether to Christianity, capitalism, or small r republicanism. And similarly, whether it's humanitarian politics, whether it's engineers that around the different world, soldiers of fortune, all these transnational actors, quite important. And if you think about the nature of American culture, where we don't have a total centralized political power, it's one of our strengths, but also the things that perhaps confuses people in the world. So definitely transnational actors play a key role. And let's connect this with the question of climate change policy. When I was leading the U.S. effort in 91, 92 on climate change, one identified the scientific nature of the problem, but we actually needed an agreement that had flexibility built in. So it's not accidental that you have politically binding commitments as opposed to legally binding commitments. This is some subject of debate for people. My own view was that you could probably get countries to stretch more with the political binding commitments than the legal commitments. And because we'd learn more about climate change, you'd have these conferences of the parties that would continue to bring back, okay, our country's following through on their commitments, how might we change, so on and so forth. And there was very early structural issues related to this. So for example, I had fierce battles actually with the Germans at the time about whether we could have sinks as well as sources, whether you, from a German order, you just sort of regulate the sources as opposed to recognize that you've got a system here that has sources as well as sinks. Could you have trading systems, whether that's violates a sense of morality that people can pay for this? And of course, how you can combine these different national action plans together, whether it be for soil carbon for Africa, avoided deforestation, forestation, and critically, the role of the IPCC in terms of the scientific feedback loops, okay? So you're bringing in scientific actors, you're bringing in development actors. Today, for example, I think one of the key points going into the Glasgow COP will be the role of private businesses, not only as investors, but I think you're going to see more pressure on corporate governance. I serve on some boards and others where whether risk committees or others will feel that they have an obligation, just like they had with cybersecurity 10 years ago, to kind of have a sense of where the company is positioned in terms of carbon. And so someone like Mark Carney is doing a lot of advances. So your question really goes to a critical point that I try to draw out a little bit in the book as a story, but it's going to be important going forward, which is nation states still remain very important. If people don't recognize that, think of the companies that can get clobbered for this, or look at the role of China with a strong sense of state sovereignty today, or as I described in the North American context. So I don't want to mislead about states' power, but it's more of a network system, and you have to understand how you're going to play with private sector actors.
Thank you very much for that. Please keep the questions coming in. Meanwhile, I'm going to ask you, if I may, another question. How would you characterize now, in retrospect, looking at the whole of the post-war period, US attitudes towards European integration? You touched on this a little bit at the time of German unification, but I'm reminded of a great quote, I think, from Kissinger, whose name's come up several times already this afternoon, where he said, I think in 1969, just before he became National Security Advisor, he says, America has consistently advocated closer European Union whilst recoiling from its potential implications. Now, how do you see that relationship? And I think it's particularly sort of relevant at the moment in the context of the debate that's going on in European circles about a high degree of strategic autonomy or the birth of some kind of European as opposed to national sovereignty. So what's your sense, if you like, of that dynamic?
Well, there's quite a history to this, and as you would expect, attitudes change in the debate. So in my chapter on 4749, you'll see that actually a man named Will Clayton, who's kind of lost to history, but is quite an important figure, was really pressing Europe much more on integration and even in terms of the currency and exchange rates and others than Europe was ready to go. And it becomes the very act of the Marshall Plan becomes, as one Dutch sort of Europeanist later said, becomes in some ways the garden in which a lot of Europeans come together to sort of understand these possibilities. As time goes on and the European Union takes form as a customs union, there's an anxiety in the United States that I describe about European protectionism. And obviously, I talked about the agriculture area. One of the difficulties as a trade negotiator in the United States is that if we negotiate for various types of openings, the meat industry would say, well, we're blocked by the hormone directive. The poultry people were blocked by chlorine. The grains people are blocked by biotech. So you go one after another, and people feel that these have been precluded. Now, there's a European perspective on this, on regulation and so on and so forth. I'm not just trying to be one-sided, but I'm trying to say these then flowed into the politics and attitudes. Then there's also, and so you have a tension also between those on the economic side and sometimes on the security side. Now you can take this too far. So today, for example, I expect a number of the US companies that are seeing individual European states come up with different digital rules saying, actually, it would be better to have a European system because they don't want to have to adapt all it. So there's always the benefits kind of the unified market, the trade-off of, is it a harder market to get into versus the benefit of being sort of a larger market. Then on the security side, when France withdrew from NATO, there was always the anxiety about holding the alliance together and whether France would be a disruptive force. France comes back into NATO, and today, actually, see, my feeling is that probably the talk that Macron engages in about sort of European military is probably the only way you could strengthen European sort of military capabilities. And my guess is the realities will lead it to still cooperate with the United States. If you look at French forces in the Sahel, they're very much, this is expensive stuff. They have the intelligence, they have the logistics and other things. So there's the trade-off. To what degree do you get, independence/autonomy? To what degree are you in a cooperative mode? And these reflect themselves in the US politics. So my own experience was that the larger interests of having Europe as a player, economically, politically, security, was worth some of those trade-offs. But at times I also would warn, about sort of the dangers flowing back into US politics. If this was 20 or 30 years ago, if France and Germany said, look, we want to handle our own security, we don't need the United States, well, be careful, because why should people in Kansas and Nebraska or my home state of Illinois pay to have their sons and daughters over in Europe if that's the case? So you have to be careful of that. We encountered this in the Balkans. Remember that I actually was one of the people with Baker in 91, 92, kind of urging the United States to be slightly more active, but we'd fought the Gulf War. We'd had in Panama, Bush faced sort of re-election. And you remember Jacques Puz of Luxembourg said, this is the hour of Europe. Europe's going to take over these things. So this is sort of an ongoing question and tension going forward. I'll close with this thought. Kissinger has also made the point, since we were invoking him, about the danger of Europe becoming a strategic appendage of Eurasia. He has a wonderful way of phrasing these. And what he really means by that is, with the rise of China in particular and the return in some ways of some traditional politics across Eurasia, does Europe have enough cohesion to deal with that? And this goes right back a little bit also to this concept of the legal order. My own view, and I've discussed this with Lamy, is that the history of Europe is based on this legal economic order. It's not quite the same as a strong sense of patriotism. You have to ask yourself, who's going to, in the United States, there are young men and women who are willing to die for the United States. Who's willing to die for Europe? I can have people die for the the Baltics or the Poland or others, but who's really, or France or Britain, but who's willing to die for Europe? And this is an emotional part of a nation state that Europe, I think, is still struggling with. Then again, to understand Europe today, even with things like the China Investment Treaty, even with sort of what at least I've been able to piece together came out of the COVID policies with the Commission in Brussels, one has to understand the procedures and kind of how the sort of standard operating system will work. And in those moments, you do need leaders, whether they're European leaders, European institutions, or nation state leaders that can kind of step in and say, the regular procedures aren't taking us where we want to go. So to be honest, Mario Draghi was one of these people with the European Central Bank. I mean, I was at the World Bank and I saw the spreads going out on European securities. One of my last meetings in 2012 and the G20, I was warning Europeans on this. Europeans didn't want to believe it. Mario Draghi saved it. And now, so he stepped into that role. So I'm not trying to say these in a way as you know, this is good or this is bad. I'm trying to describe realities. And I personally, given the shared value system across the U.S. and North America with Europe, believe that we should try to reach some understanding on these topics, even if there's not going to be full agreement. Because compared to, say, the worldview of China, we're going to still have sort of more in common. So in a sense, this question goes to the real challenge that Europeans will face with the Biden administration. And as I suggested, I'm a little worried on the trade side, because if the trade lawyers sort of act like traditional trade lawyers, you'll kind of deal with this case by case as opposed to seeing the bigger picture. And by the way, I think there's a similar analogy in the European space or in the Asia space. On trade in particular, for example, I think, you know, the big issue now is going to be digital trade. It was driving most businesses before the pandemic. It's just been accelerated. And the question is, can you come up with terms that allow basic data transfers, exchanges, and others that still allow political bodies the sovereignty to determine their rules on privacy or other protections? I think you can, but it's going to require that sort of strategic compromise with a feel for the particulars.
Thank you very much.
Oh, by the way, the last point at the end, I've written a piece, but I think the FT says they may sort of run where it's important to bring Britain back into this picture. It's very interesting. When I discuss lots of my discussions with Europeans, it's kind of, well, we got through Brexit, that's gone. You know, there's a debate in Britain about, you know, is it global Britain? What do we do? So on and so forth. You know, this is a very important country, militarily, economically, in terms of values. And what my piece is about is the United States should also be trying to kind of embrace a post-Brexit Britain, not to make it part of a US sphere, but instead to kind of strengthen it while giving it flexibility to engage, including with Europe. Because I'm a little worried that I can kind of see, as I suggested, sort of the standard operating procedures of Europe with British service industries, which are quite important, could actually lead to frictions and loss for all parties. In some ways, if the North Americans kind of create additional optionality for Britain, I actually think it could be good for Britain and Europe too.
Thank you for that. I'd like to ask you a question about the State Department. One of the conventional views post-Trump is that the State Department has been hollowed out and that it no longer has the kind of internal resilience or infrastructure to pursue a coherent US foreign policy. As somebody who spent a lot of time in the State Department, admittedly a few years back now, but has been able to observe the evolution of the department, do you think that it's is fit for purpose or can be made fit for purpose relatively quickly?
This is another multi-dimensional question. And, you know, in full disclosure, I haven't spent time in the State Department over the past 4 years. I'm kind of persona non grata. So I think I do worry they've lost a lot of good people, and certainly the morale has fallen down. I did talk with some of the transition teams and offered ideas. There are a number of aspects of this, and it actually starts with the relationship between the Secretary of State and the President. So when James Baker, who I worked with as Secretary of Treasury and State, goes over to the State Department in '89, he said, I'm the President's man at the State Department, not the State Department's man at the White House. And there was some grumbling among the Foreign Service about this. But in reality, they came to recognize that made for a much more powerful Secretary of State. It made for a much more powerful State Department in the process. So one of the challenges, so the key is more than any other cabinet post, the Secretary of State has to spend time with the President, be closely aligned with the President. You've got the White House staff, you've got the NSC staff, you've got every conceivable department with their hands in foreign policy. Just as kind of a practitioner of this morning, I'll just say I saw an article about the new memorandum setting up the National Security Council staff and others. And you're bringing in more and more people. So, the UN ambassador is part of the National Security Council, the head of AID, so on and so forth. You get this further erosion of the State Department's positions. I understand the people involved. I understand the pressures. And one of the difficulties will be, I think you may, all told, people that could attend the senior meetings, you might get 30 or 40 people. How does that work? Now, to be honest, what will happen at the top level is they'll go off and they'll create an informal system. But one of the problems actually in the Obama years was that at what you call the assistant secretary, deputy secretary's level, if you have too many people, the meetings don't sharpen the options and the decisions. And so this is all, it becomes a challenge for the State Department. Another problem, which to be honest, I'm always kind of wary of these special envoys because you've got line offices, you've got regional offices, you've got functional offices. It's kind of a mixed matrix. And you create, what happens is they start to become dysfunctional. So you create a special envoy, but you just create another special pleader sort of in the process. This will be interesting to see with John Kerry and climate change. On the one hand, it shows the president's interest in climate change. On the other hand, he's a former Secretary of State. If climate is really that important, maybe this should be the Secretary of State's job. How will he get along with Blinken? And then you start to get into questions like, okay, if you've got a climate policy, how does it fit with your China policy? If you have a climate policy, how does it fit with your developing country sort of policy? The challenge traditionally for foreign ministries is how do they play this sort of integrative role? I would also say that the career state staff are very hardworking. They're devoted to the cause, but it in some ways blame them if the process sort of reduces their creative, innovative roles. So I'll share with you a story. I went back as Deputy Secretary of State after being trade representative in 2005, 2006. I think the issue was Darfur, I forget. But so I brought together, I had the regional staff, I had functional staff, I had special envoys, I bring them in, and I'm trying to think about US policy. And so I said, okay, let's discuss the policy. And then I say, does it work? And then people just keep repeating the same talking points to me. And I finally had to say, look, we're just in here all by ourselves. I appreciate your loyalty of saying the talking points. I said, but our job today is to figure out, whether we really should change this in some way. And I said, maybe I wouldn't be able to do it. I can't promise it, but let's try to think afresh. And in a way, Anthony, as I reflected on that incident, there hadn't really been since Baker's time in '89, '92, kind of the idea generation coming from the State Department. In much of the Clinton period, it sort of came from the NSC staff. And in Bush 41, Colin Powell was a great leader, but he wasn't really effective in sort of driving the policy. So not surprisingly, the career service starts to reflect the behavioral patterns that's encouraged. A small point, one of the reasons that, again, I wrote the book is I'd like to encourage, I've tried to talk with Foreign Service Institute and others, that to get some Foreign Service officers to read the book and think about problem solving, because that's the ultimate task. So that's a big open-ended question. It deals with the education, it deals with the recruitment, it deals with the systems by which the matrix pushes information up. It can be done, and a strong Secretary of State can do it. And I'll close by saying that, I think Tony, obviously, Blinken has a very good relationship with the president. That's a plus. His challenge will be rising from being a staff person and even kind of someone trained from the Senate to being a principal. And it's early days. We'll see how that works out.
Thank you for that. Several questions have come in whilst you've been talking, and I'm going to read out 2 or 3 of them so that you can perhaps answer them together. One is from Isabel Darther, picking up on your comments on German unification and the important role that the US played in that. She says there was also the need for Pacific in the sense of peaceful transition of regime in Spain at the end of the 1970s, building to its subsequent entry into the European Union in 1986. So has the US always had an eye on the cohesion of the European continent? And also, what was the view of US policies and politics towards Spain during the Reagan years? An observation from René Haberkamp, again about German reunification. René was, of course, Director General for Interpretation in the European Commission in the 1980s and 90s, and it's delightful to see you or to be aware of you online for this event. Thank you very much for joining us, René. And she says on German unification, Jacques Delors, as president of the European Commission, really played a great role. His head of cabinet, Pascal Lamy, was in favor of unification at a time when Mitterrand was not, Thatcher was not, Lubbers was not. And then a more focused question on diplomacy and science. Michele Del Monte asks, you refer to the notion of science diplomacy. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? How do you see the interaction between the scientific and foreign policy communities evolving over time? And what is the role of international organizations such as the World Bank in that context? And if I might just add a very tiny rider to that, I'm very struck in the work that I do about how the political community and the scientific community really come from different vantage points. For the political community, ambiguity and uncertainty is absolutely essential from which to feed off in terms of identifying options and policies and having margin for maneuver, whereas of course the scientific community is more than anything else in the search for certainty. Over to you, Bob.
So on the question about Spain, the short answer is while I'm acquainted with the issue, I'm not well enough informed to give you a really good sense. I'll just say that there was a feeling, throughout the Cold War, even before the move to democracy in Spain, about Spain's both geopolitical importance. And remember, from a US point of view, Spain always has an extra role through Latin America, which may not be recognized as much in Europe, but at various times Spain has played a key role on the Latin America side. I think there was a very positive, receptive feeling about Spain's movement to democracy and the role of the monarchy and the rule of the, as I recall, it was Prime Minister Gonzalez and the Socialist Party. And at least in my era, there was a sense that we always wanted to be supportive of that ongoing both political and economic process. During my time, and this is where I'm not sure where Javier Solana said of the exact time of his career, Javier looms quite large because Javier was, speaking of science, both a scientist, he was a transatlanticist, he seemed to be an effective Spanish politician, he was a European politician, he's a very smart, very effective human being. So whether it was in his role with the European Union, whether it was his role with NATO, whether his role with Spain, he becomes quite an important interlocutor in the system. And I'll just be pleased to add that the current Spanish Foreign Minister, Arantxa Gonzalez, is of course a protege of Pascal Lamy on the trade side. So I wish her very well. But I'd have to, there was more of a recollection in the Reagan years about the movement in Portugal. And actually, this actually is in the Kissinger years, where there's a difference within the administration about sort of embracing the decolonization process. A word on the German unification. I'm glad a person brought out the role of Delors in particular in Lamy. I think maybe this is well known in Europe, but I think it was actually quite a seminal moment. And my feeling was exactly as the questioner said, that so the one European who really stepped forward and was a believer in this was Delors. And in some ways, Delors' strategy was similar to the one we had in the US, which is how do you embrace it? How do you make it work? Notice the things that they had to do with bringing in the 5 Eastern German states were not so easy within the European system. So he had to sort of customize that. But how do you further the process of European integration? I always personally liked Delors. He sometimes had a challenge connecting with U.S. audiences, and this gives you a little insight as a diplomat. I always felt bad about this. He would speak English, but his English wasn't quite the level. And to be honest, what I recognized is for a French and European leader to come to the United States and speak English was a sign of respect and decency on his part. But the communication wasn't quite as effective. So it's one of these sort of small points. But I think from a historic point of view, he certainly played a key role for Germany and France and Europe as a whole. And obviously Kohl relied on him very heavily. And as I've mentioned, I learned a lot from Pascal about the European system during those years, and which I applied sort of later in life. On the science and diplomacy, it's and international organizations. This is a fascinating topic. Harry Truman, and there have been the work over the years in the U.S. on this. One of the founders of the Kennedy School was actually a student of kind of public policy and science, but it always is kind of a fringe field. And I'm trying to bring it back a little bit more. Harry Truman had this view that you need to keep experts on tap, but not on top. And what he was referring to there was you want their expertise, but you still have to integrate them into your political system, your public support, your sort of international sort of issues. There are issues about different time frames. This is one of the challenges about the sort of for scientific developments versus sometimes traditional politics or economics and diplomacy. As you mentioned, there's the question of whether it be ambiguity or clarity or the experimental method, versus what I'll call the compromise of politics. For science, you're supposed to eventually come to some solutions, like engineers. It's not the same as sort of doing a messy sort of compromise, but often they have to be put together. So I use the Climate Change Framework Treaty in a very rough way as saying this is in some ways an experiment for trying to create a model that respects science, but also has flexibility to adapt, to bring in the politics, but it will require a different type of diplomatic mindset, as we've discussed, also sort of bringing in private and sort of transnational actors. You will see this, I think, in other walks of life in this, and so that's one reason why I'm trying to bring it to the forefront. I mean, let me take another example for today. Biological security. People are now recognizing pandemics may become endemics. I just saw a report on the news before we started the program that the COVID seemed to be traced to an intermediate animal in China. And what I've just learned from talking to virologists is, we're having increasing frequency and cost of these events, and they're very related to the interaction among wildlife, livestock, and human beings. And this one source mentioned to me there's about 800,000 viruses that have zoonotic potential that are in birds or mammals, and we don't know what they are, but for I think it was like $1.3 billion, you could understand about 70% of them. That's a very good example of we should be doing, for that amount of money, we should be doing the research to understand and prepare these sort of types of things. And I have an interest in this. I have a long interest in wildlife trade and other issues. I've tried to suggest how one could also connect the biodiversity strategy and wildlife conservation to better enforcement for sort of wildlife trade issues. When I was at the World Bank, we tried to help strengthen prosecutors be able to go after these topics. So again, it's a natural idea of how you think about networks. And since people asked about international organizations, the key here is to see them as nodes in the network, see them as resources, see them as institutions that contribute, while in my mind trying to avoid a unitary hierarchical system which won't be effective and won't be able to deal with the politics enough. So you asked about the World Bank. When I came to the World Bank, I tried to emphasize some strategic themes. One of them was public goods, and it was exactly this idea of how the World Bank could contribute across some of these areas. And just to give you an example that I was talking with a former colleague about last night, I worked with Hank Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury, to create climate investment funds. You could see that you were going to need resources. Some of the developing countries just wanted the money hand over to them. The developed countries weren't willing to do that. And so we could use some of our knowledge and expertise. And I raised, at that time, it was it was later $9 billion of funds. We were able to leverage it to $60 or $70 billion to try to also learn about weather adaptation strategies, forestation strategies, sort of other approaches. And frankly, the contrast is at least as I understand it, the Global Financing Fund that was headquartered in Korea has some very fundamental governance problems. It's not working very effectively. And so as you go forward with the climate change issue, whether through the World Bank or whether it moves its funds to these climate funds to others, you're going to need to have a trusted financing component that can also learn and have feedback loops and draw in private capital. So the key here, also referencing with the WHO, and it's a point Pascal Lamy and I have often made, it's funny when international organizations seem to fall short, then national capitals blame them. I'm sure this is a lesson in the world of European Union as well. But of course, who are the members? It's the nation states. So the reasons the WHO has limited authority is because the nation states didn't want to have authority. As I recall, Gro Brundtland was the head of the WHO in the early 2000s. She saw some of these weaknesses. She pressed for more authority without endorsing the particulars. I could understand what she's doing. And of course, she gets pushed back. So don't be surprised when WHO doesn't have the authority to do all these different things. So where that leaves me is that, recognize the strengths and weaknesses of these institutions. Some of them are sort of experts. Some of them have different field networks. How can they work with national teams? How they can work with private sector teams? Understand how they can leverage off each other. And of course, that sometimes you have to strengthen and improve them. But to be frank, not many companies or countries around the world will probably want the WHO to be able to come in to their country and decide when they've got bad diseases and the WHO can shut down different things. That's just the reality. That brings us back to the China point, by the way. If you're serious about dealing with this issue in the future, you're going to have to get greater cooperation from China. I'm not in any way sort of rationalizing what I think have been some of the Chinese obstructionism. But I will say that my guess is China doesn't want to have future pandemics either. So if you try to approach this in a way where you make it a little bit more technical, less political, how do we get at the solution and build transparency and other types of things, you'll probably have more success than if you just start out by indicting them. Now, China's behavior sometimes leads people to have pushback, so that's the nature of the political process. But what your question and this question really goes to is the reason I put that chapter in the book, because I think this is going to be an important part of all diplomacy going forward.
Thank you very much. Our time is almost up, so I'm going to just squeeze in a final question and abuse my position as chair to ask you about Jim Baker. In addition to your own book making quite an impact last autumn, this book made quite an impact too. A biography of Jim Baker, the man who ran Washington. You had the privilege to work extremely closely with him. Indeed, if I'm not mistaken, at the end of the George Bush senior years, he was chief of staff at the White House and you were his deputy. Two questions very quickly. One, do you feel that the appraisal of him does full justice to Baker in this book? I'm sure you've read it. And the second question is, working in the White House, how different is it to what one might expect? I mean, what is the feel at the in the West Wing, and how did it compare with your previous experience in government or subsequent experiences in governmental and international bodies?
So on the first one, I've read the book. I think people will enjoy it. It's a wonderful window on Baker, the negotiator and political figure. And this takes nothing away from kind of the author. And remember, the authors are wonderful political journalists. What it misses is kind of the interconnections that were also part of Baker's strategy. So let me just give you one example. It focuses on his efforts to negotiate with the Congress some financial terms in dealing with the Nicaraguan resistance, which had been a very divisive topic in the Reagan years. And it tends to treat it more as how he wanted to push this issue off the political radar. And I was at the heart of that negotiation too. What it kind of misses, there actually was a bigger strategy there. The support for the Nicaraguan resistance was combined with embracing a strategy from Costa Rica, which I don't think the Reagan administration would have ever done, to try to have a series of peace processes. It was based with putting pressure on the Soviets to withdraw support for the Sandinistas. It was based on the notion of free elections. It was based on working with Europe and, by the way, Jimmy Carter and others to kind of flood Nicaragua with observers for the election. So it was a much more multi-dimensional strategy. And there's a couple places where, again, they say, oh, Baker didn't do anything with Latin America, kind of ignored that his Treasury Secretary was part of all the debt restructurings. And frankly, he was quite key in moving forward NAFTA and other things. So people will enjoy the book. They'll learn a lot about the book. There's a dimension, this is often the case, that I think is missing on the strategic side. On the White House, the main thing I'll explain to people, if people have never been in the West Wing, if they ever get a chance to go in, it's very small. It's a small set of offices. It creates almost a sort of a family atmosphere, but it's also a very intense sort of atmosphere. And you're really at the apex of politics, policy, congressional, communications, everything pulled together. My own view, which is probably a little bit iconoclastic, is it's probably best for White House staff to have worked in departments beforehand. So, I mean, and I have that bias, right? I've been always at Treasury and State and Justice and actually in the courts and other sorts of things. Of course, most of the people who work in the White House staff come in from political campaigns, and they actually know very little about governing. And they're based on the politics of the moment. So it's, in some ways, it's kind of the ultimate challenge, and that really does focus on the role of the chief of staff, which obviously in the Trump era, you really didn't have them. They were kind of destroyed. You know, will the person who's the chief of staff for Biden is Ron Klain, is a very experienced hand. I dealt with him in the Florida recount and other circumstances. I'm sure he's got the trust. The question we'll see, and this is part of bigger American politics, is that it's hard enough to simply represent all the different political forces in your coalition, and the Democratic coalition is quite wide. What I watched Baker do quite effectively in the Reagan years was he also found opportunities to sort of work out with the opposition party. And this is partly, you know, Reagan's economic issues, bringing along some of the Democratic voters. He was always looking to expand the coalition, and partly it's partly manner and personality as much as anything. I think that's become harder to do, and people always reflect recent history. So from, you know, with Biden's decision to go for his big package using reconciliation as a budget technique as opposed to negotiating something with the Republicans, I suspect that reflects their experience in the Obama years. Obviously, they would feel that, you know, they recall the difficulties of working with Republican Congress in the Obama years. But you did have 10 Republican senators wanting to negotiate something. That may end up being a very significant move. And it'd be interesting, the chief of staff's recommendation. So in the newspaper accounts in the United States, every time Biden seemed to lean towards something, the report was Ron Klain was shaking his head, saying no. So That's to take nothing away from him. He's a very, very skilled individual. But I would emphasize this, given your question, the key role of the chief of staff and the national security advisor in trying to pull things together. In my chapter on LBJ, I emphasized there was no chief of staff. And in a sense, I'm a little hard on McGeorge Bundy, because I said if there was anybody who would have been charged with trying to pull together an alternative view, it had to be that job, because you have to be in the White House to get a sense of the president's moods, the opportunities, the time. I mean, Baker always used to say to me, you never win battles with the White House. So if you're a person like me at State or Treasury or others, you have to pick your fights. I did pick some fights, by the way, on some of those issues, and sometimes got the president to win, but I always paid a price in doing so. So it's the I'm sure this is true in European politics as well.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Bob. That was really terrific. What a wonderfully rich and evocative discussion of American political history and indeed American politics today. And we really do appreciate the fact you spent the last 90 minutes with us, sharing your reflections and talking us through this wonderful book that you wrote. We really appreciate that. And unfortunately,
and there were great questions. And also, as I said, we had the Christina Spohr event. In some ways, this book is a nice compliment to Christina's.
Exactly, it was a great compliment. We don't really have a means to express our collective appreciation on WebEx, unlike on Zoom. But I know that among those who are still with us, there is a great appreciation for your talk today. Thanks so much. And for aficionados of EPRS events, our next event will be 2 weeks from today, on Tuesday, the 23rd of February. It'll be a policy roundtable, which we will be doing jointly with the OECD, and it's going to be entitled The New Centrality of Science and Technology. Will it outlive the pandemic? It really bears upon one of the questions which Bob was kind enough to answer. So look forward to seeing as many of you as possible on that occasion. And thank you very much once again, Bob, for sparing the time and sharing your thoughts with us, which we appreciate. Goodbye, everybody.